Hi, my name is Ned Johnson. I'm the president and founder of PrepMatters, and for almost 30 years, a tutor geek. My job has been to help kids prepare for and take a whole alphabet of standardized tests. And part of helping kids do well is not just learning about the tests, but learning about themselves as learners. So I and my colleagues have taken a really keen interest in things that support learning, things like sleep and anxiety management, motivation, and we sort of begged, borrowed, and perhaps stolen a little bit from people who have really studied how brains work and how kids perform optimally under pressure. I'm the co-author of a few books, Conquering the SAT, How Parents Can Help Teens Overcome the Pressure and Succeed, and more recently, with my friend and partner and scribe, Dr. William Stixrud, of the books The Self-Driven Child, The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives, and our recent book, What'd He Say? How to Talk with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. What I'd like to talk today, though, is about some of the learning points that I find really useful to share with kids. And these are stolen and added to with a few of my own ideas from a terrific book called Make It Stick. For all the hours the kids spend in school and spend time studying, golly, we'd like to have the learning that they do stick. So let's talk about a few of the points born out of neuroscience and psychology and some of my lived experience of what helps make learning stick. Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning is a terrific book written by Peter Brown, Henry Roediger, and Mark McDaniel. And I'd love to share some of the points from that. The first one is that we want to aim for active practice over passive. Typically, what you're likely to do as a student is to go over your notes, read and reread, and we kind of get duped thinking we really know things. And what we want to do is use active practice. So if you're foreign language, to test yourself on these things. Actually, there's something called the testing effect. You can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. And the idea is simply this, that the act of actively trying to recall information is profoundly different from just passively looking at information for three reasons. One, it deepens the learning. It makes our neurons, our neural pathways, fire in ways that deepen the learning. Two, it helps us really know what we know and what we don't know so that we can be really efficient and effective with how we spend our time. And three, testing yourself is a little bit stressful as opposed to just going, I know that stuff, those are my notes. And a little bit of stress is super helpful in inoculating you against the higher stress that you're likely to feel on the day that you have a quiz or a test. The second point is what is known as spaced learning. Imagine you were at a barbecue. I was at your barbecue, and you introduce me to Mrs. Reynolds. And you say, oh, Mrs. Reynolds, we've been friends with Mrs. Reynolds for years. And I go, fantastic. And 3 minutes later, I'm like, dang, what is her name? Instead, imagine that you introduce me to Mrs. Reynolds, and I promptly forget her name because I do these things. And then a few minutes later, your mom comes along and says, oh, have you met Mrs. Reynolds, our neighbor? I said, oh, thank goodness, I've been saved. And then a half an hour later, your dad does the exact same thing. I'm so much more likely to remember her name because my brain has gotten the message that she's really important. She's everywhere. She keeps showing up. And so we want to use this principle as opposed to amassed learning to improve our learning, to make things stick. Oftentimes folks cram, a whole bunch of information all at once the day before a test, and that's fine for getting through that test, but it's terrible for long-term learning, which is part of the reason why students tend to forget 90% of what they learned within 3 months. Instead, a model is something like learn something and then review it an hour later, a day later, a week later, and a month later. And if done right, this looks like school, right? You learn something, you have homework tomorrow, you talk about it more, you have a quiz in a few days later, a test, and then a summative, cumulative thing later on. However, sometimes that first learning doesn't go so well. You're tired, you're distracted, or even just school's a little bit stressful. If you've ever had the experience of the teacher goes too fast and you're trying to make sense of what's going on, you're not learning that well in that first hour. So if you're someone who benefits from a little bit more time, use the idea of previewing. If your teacher, particularly in math or chemistry, follows things in a sequential order, you can look ahead a little bit about what you're going to see tomorrow in class. So you go, okay, great. So then the next day in class, it's actually reinforcing that learning. If you work with a tutor, don't just have them help you catch up. Have the tutor help you get ahead a little bit so it decreases the novelty and actually spaces things out so you learn things well for the long term. Third point, beyond spaced repetition, we want to avoid repetitive spaces. What am I talking about? Well, a lot of times students are told, you need one clear place to do all your homework free of distractions. Well, it turns out brains actually remember things a little bit differently. And here's what I mean. Can you remember what you had for dinner 3 Thursdays ago at your house? I can't either. Can you remember the last time you were at your grandmother's house, or the last time you were on vacation, and that cool dinner you had at the Mexican place? Chances are, yeah. One, because it's novel, but also because that memory is tied to a place. So consider having a place to do math at the kitchen table. You do your history in the living room, you do your French in your bedroom, whatever it is. By mixing up the spaces, we actually make it easier for that information to really stick, because the information is also tied to the place, not just the content. The fourth point is that people tend to remember takeoffs and landings, meaning the beginning of things and the end of things. I'm sure we've all had the experience of listening to a lecture or a sermon. I can remember being at church as a kid, and I'd pay attention to the beginning, and then blah, 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 and my brain would go off to thinking about all sorts of other things. And then I realized, oh gosh, wait, he's probably going to finish up, and I'd sort of zoom back in, and I'd pay attention to the end. What the middle was? And this is true not just for sermons or lectures, but for our own studying. We can increase our own learning by having more takeoffs and more landings, beginnings and endings. So, instead of spending 2 hours studying history and then 2 hours doing English, do 45 minutes of history and 45 minutes of English and 45 minutes. Now, I recognize that if you have ADHD and transitions are hard, you're going to have to make this individual to you. Still, we want to pay attention to how do we learn best, including how do we pay attention. And how much do we pay attention? There's a wonderful approach for attention called the Pomodoro technique. It involves working hard for 25 minutes and then taking a 5-minute break and then working hard. And again, that makes these takeoffs and landings. Part of this, though, is that it's a good idea to pay attention to how much can you pay attention. Don't try to force yourself to pay attention for 50 minutes if you're spacing out halfway through. Start with 20 minutes. Can you really be dialed in, fully focused for 20 minutes? Awesome. Then you extend it to 25 to 30. If you're starting to loop out, go for a walk, do some push-ups, take a break, get a snack, play with your dog, and then come back. We don't want to have the experience of practicing not paying attention. We want to have the experience of really paying attention in a focused way, because it's much more likely to make that learning efficient and for what we learn to stick. Number 5, take notes by hand rather than on a computer. When we take notes by hand, we can't get everything down like we do when we type, and so we really have to think about what matters, and that's really in the context of what we've already learned. One note, it is worth taking notes by a computer if you plan to go over those again and you're really just playing stenographer and getting everything down. But if there are other ways to access that information, from a textbook or online notes, then taking notes by hand is better, because it frees up our brain to really think more about what we're learning, increasing that stickiness and that spaced learning we talked about a while back. Tip 6, get enough sleep. Sleep is incredibly important for everything from physical health to mental health, but it's also vital to our best learning for 2 key reasons. One, when we're well rested, our brains are prepared to soak up information, to learn better. Not just if you fall asleep in class and everything bounces off, but when you're actually tired but it's still awake, your brain just doesn't do a very good job of paying attention or retaining what it's learned. Additionally, when we sleep well at night, our brains consolidate what we've learned. They prune away stuff that doesn't matter, they pay attention to what does matter, and then they connect that to stuff we already know. There's also a really cool thing, is that when we get a lot of sleep, our brains will make a connection not just to the adjacent thing, but to the most far away thing. And this is how we have those kind of eureka moments. We wake up the next day going, oh my gosh, because our brain has been hard at work making sense of that information that we've learned in the context of what we already know. So make sleep a key priority. In my experience, I would much, much rather teach kids for 4 hours who've slept for 8 than to teach them for 8 when they've slept for 4. Kind of a colossal waste of everyone's time. These points from the terrific book Make It Stick are some of the ones that I and my colleagues at PrepMatters share with kids every chance we get. One of the cool things of working one-on-one with kids is we get to see when things are going well and maybe not so well, and look for those opportunities to share information, share wisdom, advice on how to make things go better. Yeah, like you, we're committed to helping your kids have good grades and great test scores. But there's a lot more to learning than that, including helping kids learn about themselves, how to do it better so that they're successful long-term. Like all educators, we're committed to helping your students do their very best in everything that matters to them academically and educationally.